My name is Raymond Cole. I am 63 years old, and I have spent the better part of 4 decades doing honest work with my hands, running electrical lines through walls, pulling wire in the summer heat, coming home tired and grateful for every single day. I retired 2 years ago, thinking the hardest part of my life was behind me. I was wrong. The hardest thing I ever did not happen on a job site. It happened in a bedroom down the hall from where I slept, and it was carried out not by a stranger, but by someone who sat at my son's dinner table every single night and called herself a mother. I want you to hear this, all of it, because I spent too many weeks telling myself I was imagining things, that I was an old man who did not understand how younger families worked, that maybe I was just too sensitive, too old-fashioned, too quick to worry. I want you to hear this so that if you ever have a feeling, that quiet, persistent, stomach-level feeling that something is very wrong, you do not talk yourself out of it the way I almost did. I moved into my son's house in early spring, about 18 months ago. My son had taken a regional operations job with a logistics company, which meant he was on the road 3, sometimes 4 days a week. My daughter-in-law worked from home, at least officially, managing some kind of online business she had built over the past few years. Their boy, my grandson, was 8 years old. He was the kind of child who could make a whole room brighter just by walking into it. He had his father's forehead and his late grandmother's eyes, and when he laughed, which he used to do constantly, it was the kind of laugh that started somewhere deep in his belly and worked its way up until his whole face was involved. My son had asked me to move in because he felt guilty about being away so often. He wanted another adult in the house. He wanted someone to help with school pickups, with homework, with dinner on the nights his wife was deep in a work deadline. I was happy to do it. I sold my apartment, packed what I needed, and moved my life into their guest room. I thought I was doing my family a favor. I thought it would be easy. For the first 2 weeks, everything seemed fine. My daughter-in-law was pleasant enough, polite at breakfast, quick with a smile when my son called in the evenings. My grandson ran to me every afternoon when I picked him up from school and talked the entire drive home about his friends, his teacher, the football game at recess. He was a happy kid, energetic, full of questions about everything. But somewhere around the end of that second week, I started noticing small things. He stopped talking as much in the car. At first I thought he was tired. Kids get tired. I did not push it. But then one afternoon I picked him up and he climbed into the back seat and just sat there looking out the window. And when I asked him how his day was, he said fine in a voice that did not sound like him at all. It sounded like a word he had been taught to say so that no more questions would follow. I told myself he was having a rough patch. Kids have those. But the changes kept coming, and they were not subtle anymore. He started having trouble sleeping. I could hear him through the walls some nights, not crying exactly. More like a restless, anxious kind of movement, like a child who was bracing for something even in his dreams. The circles under his eyes grew darker. He started flinching when my daughter-in-law walked into a room too quickly. It was a small thing, barely visible, but I am a man who pays attention, and I saw it every single time. His shoulders would come up, his head would dip slightly, and then he would correct himself like a child who had learned that the flinch was not allowed. I noticed that he never asked his mother for anything when his father was not home. He would come to me instead. He would ask me for a glass of water, ask me if it was okay to watch TV, ask me if he could have a piece of fruit from the bowl on the counter. Things a child should not need permission for. Things a child should not be afraid to simply take. I started watching more carefully. My daughter-in-law was two completely different people depending on who was in the room. When my son was home, she was warm and attentive, laughing at the table, asking our grandson about his day with what looked like genuine interest. The moment my son's car pulled out of the driveway, something changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that would set off immediate alarm bells, but in the way a temperature changes. The room got a few degrees colder. She would walk past him without acknowledging him. She would answer his questions with one word or not at all. She would correct him in a tone that had an edge to it I could not quite name but could absolutely feel. One evening, about 5 weeks after I had moved in, I was washing dishes after dinner, and I heard her speaking to him in his room. The door was partially open. I cannot repeat every word she said, but the tone of it stopped me cold. It was not a mother correcting a child. It was something else entirely. Something deliberate and cutting, spoken low and controlled, the way someone speaks when they know exactly what they are doing and do not want anyone else to hear them doing it. I set down the dish in my hand and stood very still. My grandson did not say anything back, and somehow that silence was worse than anything he could have said. I knocked on the door frame and said I was going to make hot chocolate if anyone wanted some. My daughter-in-law turned around with a perfectly pleasant expression and said that sounded lovely. My grandson looked at me, and in his eyes I saw something that I have thought about every day since. It was gratitude. Not the gratitude of a child who wants hot chocolate. It was the gratitude of someone who had just been pulled out of something. That night I could not sleep. I thought about calling my son. I went back and forth on it for hours. What would I say? That I had a bad feeling? That his wife's tone of voice had unsettled me? He was 3 states away on a job site. I did not have anything concrete. I did not want to create chaos in their marriage based on something I could not prove. I told myself I would keep watching. I told myself I would wait until I had something real. I almost waited too long. About a week later, I was helping my grandson with a bath before bed. He had come in from playing outside, covered in mud, and I was trying to get him cleaned up before his mother noticed the state of his clothes, and I saw bruising on his left. It was not a fresh bruise. It was the kind that was turning from purple to yellow at the edges, which meant it had been there for several days at least. It was positioned in a way that did not make sense for a fall or a collision with playground equipment. It was the kind of mark that comes from fingers. I kept my voice completely steady. I asked him how he got it. He told me he had bumped into a door. He said it so quickly and so flatly that I knew immediately he had been made to practice that answer. I told him that was okay. I told him I loved him. I tucked him in, I kissed him on the forehead, and I walked to my room and sat on the edge of my bed and tried to figure out what to do next. Here is what I will tell you, and I want this part to be very clear, because when I hear stories like mine, this is always the part people find hardest to understand. I did not go straight to my daughter-in-law that night. I did not call the police that night, though God knows I wanted to. I made a calculated decision, and I consulted a friend of mine who spent 30 years as a family court attorney before he retired, that if I wanted to ensure that my grandson was permanently safe, and not just temporarily removed while evidence was disputed or minimized, I needed to do this correctly. My friend told me that documentation was everything. He told me that without clear, undeniable proof, accusations within a family can be turned around in ways that leave the child in more danger than before, and leave the person trying to protect them discredited. So I went to the hardware store the next morning while my daughter-in-law was on a work call and my grandson was at school, and I purchased a small, motion-activated camera designed to look like a common household item. I placed it in my grandson's room in a position where it would capture the area near his bed. I told myself I would check it every single morning before my grandson woke up. I told myself I would call the police the moment I had footage of anything at all, that showed what I believed was happening in that room. I did not have to wait long. 3 nights after I installed that camera, I woke up at 2 in the morning and could not get back to sleep. I lay there listening to the house and heard the faint sound of a door opening down the hall. I heard footsteps. I heard my grandson's door open. I heard it close. I looked at my phone. The camera had sent me a motion alert. I watched on my phone, lying in my bed in the dark, what happened in my grandson's room that night. I am not going to describe it in full detail, because some of it I cannot bring myself to repeat, and some of it my grandson deserves to have kept private. But I will tell you that what I saw on that footage was not discipline. What I saw was not a mother who had lost her patience. What I saw was methodical. It was practiced. It was the behavior of someone who had been doing this for a long time and had developed a routine around it, including exactly how to keep a child quiet, including exactly what to say to a child to make him believe that what was being done to him was his own fault, including the precise tone of voice to use so that the child would feel too ashamed and too frightened to ever tell anyone. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped my phone. I did not go into the hallway. I know that sounds impossible. I know that every instinct I had was screaming at me to get up, to open that door, to stop it. But I had made a promise to my friend, and more importantly, I had made a promise to my grandson. Even though he did not know, I had made it the promise that I would get this right, that I would not do something in the heat of the moment that could be undone by a good defense attorney. I stayed in my room. I watched. I made sure the recording was saved in 3 places, and I spent the remaining hours of that night sitting in the dark, preparing for what I was going to do the moment the sun came up. The first call I made was to my retired attorney friend. I explained what I had seen. He told me to contact Child Protective Services and local law enforcement together on the same morning, so that neither could defer to the other. He told me to have the footage copied and stored in a way that established clear timestamps. He told me not to confront my daughter-in-law before law enforcement was involved, because a confrontation could prompt her to create a counter-narrative, could prompt her to coach our grandson, or could escalate into something that put the boy in immediate danger. The second call I made was to my son. That was the hardest call I have ever made in my life. He was in a hotel room 2 states away, and I could hear in his voice that he thought I was calling about something ordinary, a school issue, a scheduling question. When I told him what I had seen, there was a silence on the line that lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard a sound from him that I had not heard since he was a child and his mother passed away. I told him I needed him to come home, but I needed him to come home calmly, because our grandson was in that house, and I could not have anything tipping off what I had done. He was in the car within 10 minutes. At 8:45 that morning, while my daughter-in-law was upstairs and my grandson was eating cereal at the kitchen table, I called the local police department and CPS simultaneously, with my attorney friend on a separate phone walking me through the conversation. I stepped outside onto the back porch. I spoke quietly, and I was completely clear. I told them what I had observed over the preceding weeks. I described the bruising. I told them about the footage. They told me to keep the child in sight and not to alert anyone in the household. They said they would have someone there within the hour. I went back inside. I sat down at the kitchen table across from my grandson, and I asked him if he wanted me to make him eggs. He said, "Yes, please, Grandpa." He said it the way he used to say things, before all of this openly, without checking over his shoulder first, and I think in that moment I came closer to losing my composure than at any other point in this entire story. I made him eggs. I sat across from him while he ate. I watched him, and I thought about every morning I had not been there, every night I had not been there, and I had to remind myself that I was there, now, and that what was going to happen in the next few hours was going to make sure I could keep being there for a very long time. The officers arrived at 9:30. My daughter-in-law came downstairs when she heard the knock, and I watched her face in the moment she opened the door and saw 2 uniformed officers and a CPS caseworker standing on the porch. Something moved across her expression very fast, something she quickly replaced with confusion and concern, the practiced expression of a person who has rehearsed for exactly this possibility. She said, "Is everything okay? What is this about?" I stepped forward. I said, "It is about our grandson." My son arrived 20 minutes later. He walked straight past his wife without looking at her and went directly to where our grandson was sitting with the CPS caseworker in the living room. I watched my son kneel down in front of his boy and wrap his arms around him, and I watched my grandson, for the first time in weeks, begin to cry, the kind of crying that is actually a release, the kind that means something has finally been allowed out that was being held in very, very tightly. The officers had my phone. They had reviewed the footage. They were not ambiguous about what they were looking at. My daughter-in-law was escorted out of the house that afternoon. What came out in the following days made everything worse and also, somehow, more comprehensible. When the investigators interviewed my grandson, a gentle, age-appropriate interview conducted by a specialist trained specifically for this, he was able to tell them that this had been happening for over a year. 1 year. 12 months in which my grandson had woken up not knowing whether the night would be one of the bad ones. 1 year in which he had gone to school with bruises hidden under long sleeves and told himself that this was somehow his fault, because that is what he had been told, repeatedly, until he believed it. They also discovered, in the course of their investigation, that my daughter-in-law had been discussing this behavior with her own sister, who lived 40 minutes away, and who had visited our home at least 4 times during the year this was occurring. Her sister had not reported anything. Her sister had, in fact, on at least one occasion, advised my daughter-in-law on how to keep our grandson from saying anything to his teachers. When this became clear, I made sure, through my attorney friend and through the investigators, that this was documented and included in the record. I was not going to allow someone who had known a child was being hurt and had chosen to protect the person doing the hurting to walk away from that without consequence. Both of them ultimately faced charges. My son moved our grandson out of that house within 48 hours. They stayed with me temporarily while the legal process began. I want to say that the legal process was swift and clean, but that would not be honest. It was slow. It was complicated. There were moments when our family's attorneys told us things that made me want to put my fist through a wall. There were custody hearings and psychological evaluations and documents to be filed and waiting periods that felt completely inhumane given what we knew and what the footage showed. There were days when my grandson asked me questions I did not have good answers for. Questions like why it had taken so long for anyone to find out. Questions like whether he had done something to cause it. Questions that broke my heart every single time. I told him the truth, in the most gentle version I could find. I told him that some things that happen to us are never, ever our fault, even when the person doing them tries to make us believe that they are. I told him that the people who are supposed to protect us sometimes fail, and that when that happens, it is not a reflection of our worth, it is a reflection of their failure. I told him that I was sorry it had taken me as long as it had. I told him that from the moment I saw something was wrong, I did not stop until it was fixed, and that I would never stop not as long as I had breath in my body. He asked me once, in that quiet, serious way he has, whether I wished I had found out sooner. I told him yes, absolutely yes. I told him that I would spend the rest of my life wishing I had been paying attention from the very first day. He thought about that for a moment, and then he told me that he was glad I lived with them now. He said it simply, the way children say the things that go the deepest, and I had to turn toward the window for a moment so he would not see my face. The legal process concluded just over 4 months after that morning on the back porch. My daughter-in-law entered a guilty plea on 2 counts. Her sister reached her own separate agreement with prosecutors for her role in what had happened. My son was granted full custody of our grandson. The court also ordered a comprehensive therapeutic program, professional counseling structured specifically for children who have experienced ongoing abuse, which my grandson has been attending every week since. I want to tell you what I have seen in the months since then, because this part matters just as much as everything that came before it. My grandson started sleeping through the night again about 6 weeks after the legal process ended. My son told me that one morning he came down for breakfast to find the boy already up, already at the table, already eating cereal with his feet swinging against the chair legs and humming something under his breath. He said he stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment just watching him, because it was the first time in over a year that his son had looked like himself. He started talking in the car again. Not right away, there were weeks where the silences were still heavy and I did not push. But gradually, the way a plant comes back after a hard winter, the words started returning. First a few sentences, then full stories. Then the endless questions that I had missed so badly, questions about everything, about how electricity works and what stars are made of, and whether dogs dream, and why some people are mean when being mean does not seem to help anyone. I answered every single question with everything I had. He asked me once, about 3 months in, whether I would always live with them. I told him that I would live wherever he needed me to be. He said, okay, in that satisfied way children have when an answer lands exactly right. His father is home far more now. He made changes at work, significant ones, the kind that cost him professionally but that he made without hesitation and does not regret. He calls me every morning on his drive in. We talk about small things mostly, about our grandson's progress at school, about a funny thing he said at dinner, about whether his team is going to have a good season this year. We talk about ordinary things because ordinary things are what we almost lost, and neither of us will ever take them for granted again. I have thought a great deal, in the time since all of this happened, about the weeks before I installed that camera, about all the times I noticed something, felt something, and then found a way to rationalize myself out of acting on it. I was afraid of being wrong. I was afraid of damaging my son's marriage on the basis of a feeling. I was afraid of being perceived as an interfering old man who did not understand how things worked. I let those fears take up space that should have been occupied by one simple truth. When a child shows you fear, you do not ask yourself whether you are reading the situation correctly. You act. You ask questions later. If there is anything I would ask anyone listening to take away from this, it is that children do not always have the words. They often do not have the words, but they always have the signals, and the signals are always there if you are paying attention. The flinching, the silence that comes too fast, the way they stop asking for ordinary things, stop taking up ordinary space, stop being loud and careless and freely themselves the way children are supposed to be. When a child who used to run toward you starts making himself small, that is not a phase. That is a message, and it is directed at anyone willing to receive it. I received mine too slowly. I will live with that, but I received it, and I did not let it go until my grandson was safe. He turned 9 last month. His father and I took him to a game, his team, the one he has loved since he was old enough to know what football was. We sat in the cold with our jackets zipped up and cups of hot cider, warming our hands. And my grandson spent the entire second half standing up on his seat because he could not contain himself, because his team was winning, because he was 9 years old and at a football game, and everything in his world was all right. He grabbed my arm at one point when something happened on the field, and he looked up at me with those eyes that are so much like his grandmother's, and he was grinning so wide I could count every tooth in his head. I cannot describe what that felt like. I do not have words for it that are adequate. But I will tell you that I sat in that stadium in the cold, and I thought about the night I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark with shaking hands, and a phone showing me something that should never have happened. And I thought about every decision I made from that moment forward. And I thought, this right here is why you do not look away. This face, this kid standing on his seat in the cold, not even watching the field anymore because something is too exciting for him to hold still for. This is why you always act. Pay attention to the children in your life. Trust what you see in their eyes, even when their words say something different. Speak up for them, even when it is uncomfortable. Even when you are afraid of being wrong, even when the situation is complicated and the people involved are people you love. Children cannot advocate for themselves the way adults can. They are counting on us to be brave enough to do it for them. My grandson is counting on stars tonight in his room down the hall. He started doing that again recently. His grandmother taught him the names of them when he was 5, and for a while he stopped caring. He is counting stars. And I am sitting here thinking about all the ways love asks us to be better than we think we can be. Be better. For them,